I very happily now was black, but I didn't always, because I became black in America. When I went to the US to go to university, I realized, oh, I'm suddenly something else called black. And it's not to say that I didn't know that my skin is the glorious color of chocolate, but it's that, which I wouldn't change for anything, by the way, but it's that idea that that there's meaning attached to skin color in certain parts of the world. And I had come from Nigeria where really skin color didn't have meaning. Ethnicity had meaning. Religion had meaning. And then to come to the US and to be in class and to write an essay which the professor said, who wrote this? This is the best essay. And I raised my hand and he looked surprised. And it was a very small, fleeting moment. And it was maybe my 4th week in the US. But that's when I realized to be black is to have people make certain assumptions, that you cannot write the best essay, for example, that you need extra help with schoolwork, for example. That's interesting. Beyond author, human. I think it depends on where I am. I think identity is I find identity to be such a fluid thing. And I don't mean that I become different people in different places. I mean that I'm many things at the same time. But depending on where I am, one thing is highlighted more, I think. And because I have 2 homes, I live in Nigeria and I live in the US. And I find that in the US, it's my being black that's sort of present, front and center, and just in ways that are practical. And so an example is just a few days ago, I was going to board my flight at Washington, D.C., Dulles Airport, and I'm going into the premium line, and the guy standing there says, "That way, ma'am," and he points to economy. And I realize this is why identity matters. It has real consequences, because it comes with all of these stereotypes. And so he assumed that looking as I did, I shouldn't be in that line, right? And other people just sort of walk past, but he's like, "Ma'am, go to economy." In Nigeria, that wouldn't happen because most people look like me. And I think maybe in Nigeria, what would then be more at the forefront would be my ethnicity and my gender.
Right. What are your thoughts on identity and authorship? I know that some of your very earliest writing as a child was informed by the stories you were reading. I seem to remember something about there being a lot of snow in those stories, even though you didn't really grow up with them. Yes. Can you maybe reflect on, I guess, the role of identity in writing and where you feel perhaps the tensions may or may not be? Just to roll a little second question in there, because I'd love to just hear you reflect on all of this. I know that in America there's this new thing seems to be going on about own voices, this idea that we want to hear from the people who are actually from a community or have a particular identity, etc. Do you, on the whole, see that as a positive development, or is there also a danger that we only want to hear about black people, white people from white people, women from women, etc.?
I think it's complicated because I do think we need to have more voices. We need to have, because I think storytelling doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's always questions of power and access. And so I think that many people who feel very strongly about that are coming from a good place. But there's always a danger, I think, of then reducing things and becoming very reductionist. I'm a keen believer in having more voices, having more stories, having different kinds of storytelling. But at the same time, I do believe that there is such a thing as the ability to... there's a wonderful line I like, which is that to read literature is to become alive in a body that is not your own. And I think that sometimes also to tell stories is to inhabit bodies that are not yours. And so I want to be able to tell whatever story calls me. I don't want to feel constrained. If I choose tomorrow to write a story about a woman who lives in Stockholm and is blonde and blue-eyed, I want to be able to write that. But I think that the question is to do it well. And I think that's where power comes in. So we live in a world where for so long, Africa, Asia, Latin American stories have not been told by people from there, right? So that you go to a bookstore and you go to a bookstore in London, for example, and go to the Africa section, and there are many of these books by, they still have a colonial sort of tinge to them. And it's not that we don't, those stories are important. I want to know how England wrecked Nigeria. It's very important. But because, actually what's happening in the world today, if you look back historically, I find it so interesting because I think if you look back at what's happening all over, we're talking about Hong Kong a few minutes ago, you just find that England has been meddling in all of those places. And now we're being haunted by the past. That's what's happening today. But anyway, I won't go into a rant about that. I don't think we have the time. But, no, but I don't remember what we were saying.
I think you've largely answered it. The identity sorry. I think you've largely answered it. But what I actually wanted to follow up with on there is the sensitivity around all this. And maybe that's quite a nice bridge to more generally language, literature, but generally also just discourse in this room and everywhere, and comfort, the need for comfort and staying away from discomfort. And I thought this would be a good moment to bring in my personal favourite, Americana, which you have once reflected on as your fuck you book. And no, I'm not saying this to embarrass you. It's probably, you may disagree, but it feels like perhaps the most honest, clear language in there, very unfiltered. For those for those two people in this room who haven't read it, can you start with just maybe talking us through a little bit? Your protagonist has a blog, and you seem to use that as a device, unless I'm completely misunderstanding it, to sort of speak unfiltered, if you will. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
By the way, I think it's more than two people. I think some gentlemen there, we don't know what the heck you're talking about. But don't worry, you haven't missed anything if you haven't read it. But I wanted to, and I did say it's my fuck you book. And I think I maybe had a glass of wine before I had that interview, because then these things haunt you, right? People are like, you said it. But I do, and what I meant, and I stand by it, it is my fuck you book, because I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. And I felt that a lot of literature was very, that in the name of nuance, people were not being honest. Especially about things like race in America. And so I wanted to write a novel that I felt had a kind of, what in some ways I call a cinema verite quality, that I want to have a lens with which I'm looking clearly at the society that I now call my home. But fiction still has certain expectations and certain requirements. And so I decided to use this blog as a way to kind of subvert those expectations. So in the blog, my character takes on this persona where I wanted it to be funny, because when I was writing it, would laugh, writing it, then I would start to worry that I was laughing at my own jokes, right? Because then you're like, is this
it's
healthy?
Funny. It's
right?
funny.
Okay, thank you. It's good to know. But also I think humor and a certain kind of just in-your-faceness to talk about things in ways that I think we shy away from. And we shy away from those things sort of using the language of art and nuance and complexity, which sometimes for me just equals dishonesty, right? Race is a real thing. It's a real thing because it has real consequences in people's lives. But it's also very complicated and complex, and also sometimes quite absurd. And I wanted to use that blog to write that in a way, and I knew very early on from my editor's response that it would be, interesting. She talked about nuance. She's like, we need more nuance, by which she meant take all the honest bits out.
Were you, maybe with this book, but more broadly, have you ever run into the phenomenon of sensitivity screeners, and perhaps more broadly, what do you make of this? And maybe you can explain for those who aren't here what it is, but what do you worry about this trend?
I didn't when I wrote Americana. It's been a few years. So apparently the sensitivity screening thing hadn't become a thing.
Right.
So sensitivity screening is something where you write a book and then sensitivity readers read it to find out who can possibly be offended and what you need to change. I think this is an absolute disaster for storytelling. I think that to tell a story means that the only thing that one should focus on is truth. And for me, it's emotional truth as well as, truth. And somebody, my feeling is that storytellers do not ever start out, real storytellers never start out deliberately to offend. I think that we now live in a world of people who provoke for a living, but those are not real storytellers, in my opinion. People who tell stories are telling stories because they're seeking truth. And maybe somebody will be offended, maybe, but I don't think it's healthy for storytelling, for the enterprise of storytelling, to have sensitivity readers. Because in the end, you're just going to flatten the story, right? You're going to, you're just going to take out every bit that's interesting, I think. But I don't want to be too flippant about it, because it's also important to, I think, acknowledge that, again, I think going back to storytelling and power, there have been stories told about different communities, different groups, different countries that have been offensive, sometimes deliberately so. And being Nigerian, being African means I grew up reading lots of books about people who were supposed to be African, who I found so stupid that I identified with the European storytellers, because I thought, surely, these people are, I thought I was, because the Europeans were always the sort of the smart ones who made sense, the African characters were always really stupid, or the noble savages. So I thought, no, these people are foreign to me. Yeah, so there's a history of that in the world, and I think it's important to correct that. But I do worry that there's the likelihood of overcorrecting that,
Sure.
where now you have, books where you're reading them and you're thinking, but you're lying, right? But this isn't actually true.
Actually, just really briefly, on talking about race, I was recently working on an article on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and quite a few employers told me that they're very comfortable talking about gender now, because they all, one told me this completely off the record, they all have wives or mothers. They find race much harder because they are worried to offend, in the words of several. What
race are they? White. Yeah.
I don't want to ask you, because I know you are often asked to represent all black people, but what would you say to people like that who are worried about saying the wrong thing and therefore leave the issue altogether?
I think we need to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. But I also think that we now live in a world where there's a kind of enforced orthodoxy of language, and I think it's very dangerous. So there are people who don't know what the latest word is, and when they don't use that latest word, because they don't know it, somebody comes after them. Yeah. So that kind of orthodoxy I find very, very dangerous. I believe very much in looking at context and intent. So I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine said,
Again, welcome back again to this particular episode, brothers and sisters, kings and queens of Africa. I salute you. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she has never stopped mesmerizing me. And kudos to that. I would say that she meticulously has a way of, approaching scenarios, especially this particular context here where we see she meticulously does maneuver through her book, quote unquote, as we've listened, and for the purpose of sensitivity right now here. Okay, we are not going. Okay, good. The fuck your book, rather, in this particular context. Now, she finds a reason to be able to defend herself, given the fact that that title itself provokes and the uncomfort, kind of a situation in many people's whoever that are going to read. And she, of course, responds as to why is she comfortable with that, or she's not comfortable. And of course, we need to be uncomfortably uncomfortable, or comfortably uncomfortable in such kind of settings. One needs to be free, especially given the fact that you're telling stories, and then of course that sense of humor, sense of funniness and also the way you want it to come out won't really come out as she has already put it. And I do find that I do agree with her to a larger extent. But then, what exactly, guys, do you think about this particular lady from Africa, this queen from Africa here? But above all, I feel like there has been an awakening and of course a reminder that you see what literature in that particular world is not just only meant for the few, maybe the exclusive ones with brown eyes, blue eyes, people who eat, please no, they eat apples, and they talk about weather, each and every time. But then it cuts across that you can be an African, a skin of a chocolate with the kinky hair as she is, but then also end up being in literature books. And that is my refrain at that particular point. Guys, if you do maybe you bump across the particular channel by accident, my brothers, sisters, kings and queens, a thumbs up. A thumbs up and a subscription, a tiny little comment on the comment section you want to you bad, and let's keep on supporting this particular work, support each other as we keep on enlightening and also opening up Africa in many ways. That is including this particular platform that we're having here, trying to remind ourselves what is our true authenticity, authentic value, what is our value as Africans, and what do we bring on the table as far as the global platform is concerned. Cheers, guys, until we meet in the next upload.